Ypres, Flanders, Langemarck, Champagne, Verdun, Somme, Cambrai. Great battle in France. Many of these bloody sites of the First World War, with their millions of dead, are still familiar to those interested in military history, even today, more than 100 years after the events took place. But who still remembers the German Asia Corps? The deployment of larger German and Austro-Hungarian troop numbering around 25,000 men to support the Ottoman Empire, today's Turkey, is the subject of this video. And just as the Asian theater of war and its protagonists have been forgotten, the greatest victory achieved by German-Austrian troops on Italian soil in 1917 has also faded from memory. The last battle of the Isonzo, of which there had already been 11 before. These battles were named after the 136-kilometer-long Isonzo River, which flows through the mountainous region of Friuli-Venezia Giulia in Italy, and is famous for its emerald green color, which remains, though somewhat diminished, even in the last part of its course, until it flows into the Gulf of Trieste south of Monfalcone. Once before, on the 5th and 6th of September, in the year 394 AD, major battles had taken place near the Isonzo at the river Wipach, Slovenian Vipava, which flows into the Isonzo. The Battle of the Frigidus River was fought between the commander of the Christian army, Eastern Roman Emperor Theodosius I, and the Western Roman Emperor Flavius Eugenius, who led the pagan soldiers. This battle was one of the largest, most costly, and bloodiest of all antiquity, but it also sealed the final victory of Christianity over the ancient Roman religion. The battles of the Isonzo during the First World War were similarly bloody and costly when the Royal Italian Army fought against the army of Austria-Hungary, whose units, since 1889, bore the letters K and K before their designations, standing for Imperial and Royal. Without getting ahead of ourselves, after the 12th battle, up to 400,000 soldiers had been killed and hundreds of thousands more wounded or missing, making these battles among the costliest of the First World War. The first lasted from June 23rd to July 7th, 1915, and from August 18th to September 12th, 1917. And although the Italians were able to achieve successes in 6 battles, the 1st, 2nd, 6th, 7th, 10th, and 11th, they had not managed to capture the Austro-Hungarian positions, but at most gained local advantages. 2 Isonzo battles, the 5th and 8th, ended in a draw, and 3 were won by the Austro-Hungarian army. The 3rd and 4th in 1915, and the 9th at the end of 1916. But now, in 1917, after the Italian victories in the summer and late summer of that year, there were fears that the Imperial and Royal Army, which was also fighting on many other fronts and was made up of German-speaking Austrians, Hungarians, Croats, Czechs, Bosnian Muslims, Poles, Slovaks, and so on, would no longer be able to withstand a 12th Italian assault on the Isonzo. That was also the content of a letter that Austria's Emperor Karl I had written to the German Emperor Wilhelm II. And although the situation for the German armies in both the West and the East was extremely tense, the German High Command had decided to eliminate the Isonzo front once and for all through a joint German-Austrian offensive operation. This led to the last Isonzo battle, the 12th, from October 24th to 27th, 1917, or rather until November 19th, when the fighting shifted to trench warfare along the northern Italian river Piave. Number 12 is also called the Battle of Karfreit, named after one of the focal points of all the Isonzo battles, the city of Karfreit, which was Austrian until 1918, Slovenian Kobarit, Italian Caporetto. That is why the Italians also refer to this battle as Battaglia di Caporetto, meaning the Battle of Caporetto. For this, Austria-Hungary and the German Empire together deployed 34 divisions with an estimated 353,000 men and 2,147 guns, which were to attack and defeat the 41 Italian divisions with an estimated 667,000 men and 2,430 guns of all calibers. Given these numbers, the German K and K attackers had 40% fewer troops than their opponents. Like here, for example, the soldiers of the Italian elite unit Bersaglieri, commander of the 14th Army, in which all German divisions were initially grouped together and which was later reinforced by 3 Imperial and Royal Large units, was the Knight of the Prussian Order Pour le Mérite, with oak leaves, General of the Infantry, Otto von Below. Chief of the General Staff from September 17 was the founding father of the German mountain troops, Lieutenant General Konrad Kraft von Dellmensingen. This officer, born in 1862 in the Berchtesgaden region, joined the Royal Bavarian Artillery in 1881. The First World War first saw him as Chief of Staff of the 6th Bavarian Army. Then in 1915, he took command of the German Alpine Corps, an elite unit intended for mountain warfare. In 1917, Kraft, now Chief of Staff of the 14th Army, found a previously quiet and comparatively lightly defended sector on the upper Isonzo for the attack in the 12th Battle of the Isonzo. 20 years later, in 1937, the barracks of the 79th Mountain Artillery Regiment in Garmisch-Partenkirchen were named after Kraft. After the Second World War, the United States Army then used this property and, as early as 1945, had all names that sounded suspicious to them removed. Then, in 1975, when the staff of the 1st Mountain Division of the Bundeswehr was relocated to the barracks taken over from the Americans, it regained its old name, Kraft von Dellmensingen Barracks. 19 years later, in 2004, the division staff moved to Munich, and the United States Army moved back into the property, now referred to as the Artillery Barracks. Only the barely legible name, Kraft von Dellmensingen Barracks, above the door of an accommodation building, reminded people of the general. Another 7 years later, in 2011, this inscription, which was considered a threat to the existence of the Federal Republic of Germany and the Free State of Bavaria, attracted the attention of a former Catholic religion teacher from Kaufbeuren. He had already demanded the renaming of the Mittenwald General Kubler Barracks in 1995 and had succeeded in getting it changed by the Christian Democratic Union Defense Minister Ruhe and the Inspector General. After enough disputes, the United States Army also had this last reference to General Kraft von Dellmensingen, who is accused of anti-Semitic ideas, removed. Artillery commander of the 14th Army was Major General Richard von Behrendt, a forgotten officer who was undoubtedly one of the most important German artillerymen of the First World War. The opponents of the German and Austro-Hungarian armies were the 1st Italian Army, with headquarters in Verona under General Guglielmo Pecori Giraldi, the 2nd Army, headquartered in Genoa under General Luigi Capello, the 3rd Army with headquarters in Milan under General Emmanuel Philibert of Savoy in Aosta, the 4th Army, headquarters in Bologna under Mario Nicolis di Robilant, and the Carnia Army Corps, stationed in the northeastern Italian part of Friuli in the Carnic Alps, under General Giulio Cesare Tassoni. In contrast, the German-Austrian allies had, among others, deployed on the Imperial and Royal side, the Tyrol Army Group under Field Marshal Franz Conrad von Hötzendorf, Here, during an inspection, the 11th Imperial and Royal Army under Colonel General Victor Graf von Scheuchenstuhl, the 10th Imperial and Royal Army under Colonel General Alexander Freiherr von Krobatin, and the Southwest Front under Field Marshal Archduke Eugen von Österreich-Teschen. The following large units had already been deployed in the operational area. The 1st Imperial and Royal Isonzo Army under the command of Lieutenant Field Marshal Svetozar Borowevich von Boyna, led by General of Infantry Johann Ritter von Henriques, and the 2nd Imperial and Royal Isonzo Army under Colonel General Wenzel von Wurm. The 1st Imperial and Royal Division under Lieutenant Field Marshal Joseph Metzger, the 50th under Major General Karl von Garabeck, and the 55th Infantry Division under Major General Prince Felix Hubert von Schwarzenberg. Here in 1897 as a young officer with his wife. In contrast, the 3rd Imperial and Royal Edelweiss Infantry Division under Lieutenant Field Marshal Heinrich Wiedin von Alpenbach and the 22nd Rifle Division under Lieutenant Field Marshal Rudolf von Müller had to be brought in from Trentino, which belonged to Austria-Hungary until the end of the First World War. The German Army Command had planned 4 corps with 12 divisions for the operation, including the following major German units that were deployed from the first day of the battle. German Jager Division under their commander, Colonel Georg von Wuttke. The 12th Silesian Infantry Division, brought in from Alsace, under General of the Infantry Arnold Leckis. The 117th Infantry Division, formed in 1915 from contributions of other divisions on the Western Front, under Major General Paul Seidel. The German Alpine Corps, also formed in 1915, and previously deployed at all critical points of the Eastern and Western Fronts under Major General Ludwig von Tutschek. The battle-tested Royal Württemberg, 26th Infantry Division under Lieutenant General Eberhard von Hofacker. The 15th Infantry Division, formerly the 200th Jaeger Division, formed on the Eastern Front, now the 200th Infantry Division under Major General Hans von Below, as well as the Brandenburg 5th Infantry Division under Lieutenant General Hasso von Wedel. Some of these large units, including the German Alpine Corps, were already accustomed to mountain warfare, as they had fought in the Vosges, Macedonia, and the Carpathians. Other regiments, including the numerous ones brought in from the Eastern Front, had to be trained for combat in this new type of terrain. In addition to the divisions just mentioned, the 14th German Army also had 3 Imperial and Royal Large units as Army reserves. The 4th Infantry Division under Field Marshal Lieutenant Pfeffer, the 33rd Infantry Division under Field Marshal Lieutenant Arthur Iwanski von Iwanina, and the 33rd Rifle Division under Field Marshal Lieutenant Franz Kauser Edelherr von Maasfeld. Later, 2 more infantry divisions were brought in. After the deployment in the Flitsch and Tolman area was complete, 4 Imperial and Royal divisions marked in light green were positioned on the right attack wing, the 3rd Edelweiss Division, the 22nd and 55th Infantry Divisions, and in the center, the 50th Infantry Division. On the left wing, the main focus of the offensive, stood the German 12th Infantry Division, shown in dark green, the Alpine Corps, as well as the German 200th, 26th Infantry Divisions, and, slightly behind the 1st Imperial and Royal Infantry Division, the 5th German Division. The attack on the Italian front began on Wednesday, October the 24th, 17, at 2 o'clock in the morning, with a heavy bombardment of the Italian positions by German and Imperial and Royal artillery of all calibers, which had already caused heavy casualties in the trenches and, on the right Italian wing, led to massive signs of disintegration, in other words, desertions, which also swept along their neighbors. At the same time as the artillery attack, German engineer companies had fired 70,000 gas shells with launchers, using new poison gases previously unknown on the southern front, in such large quantities that the gas clouds settling in the valleys left almost no survivors in the forward Italian positions. When the German Imperial and Royal regiments attacked and, as seen here, very quickly took prisoners already on the first day of the attack, contrary to all the bloody experiences gained in offensive operations on the Western Front in France, the triple-layered Italian mountain positions were smoothly breached and literally torn apart. The Alpine Corps distinguished itself in this battle, including the Württemberg Mountain Battalion, commanded by First Lieutenant Erwin Rommel, who took 8,000 prisoners, and the Silesian 12th Infantry Division. From now on, especially in the area of the 2nd Italian Army, almost unimaginable scenes unfolded. Numerous Italian regiments surrendered without a fight along with their officers, while others had simply thrown away their weapons and even outwardly demilitarized themselves. Then, often drunk and now in civilian clothes, a demoralized Italian soldiery set out for home, plundering villages along the way. By the evening of the first day of the attack, 30,000 Italian prisoners had already been taken, and after 3 days, the German troops had captured the Italian positions at Karfreit. The approaches to the northern Italian plain had been reached everywhere, and by the 4th day there were already 200,000 Italian prisoners. Meanwhile, the uncoordinated retreat had turned into a chaotic stream of soldiers, which also included tens of thousands of fleeing civilians. The fact that this surprisingly rapid German-Austrian success had been possible at all was also due to the reckless behavior of the Italian High Command under its Chief of Staff Luigi Cardona, who was poorly regarded by the soldiers and is now considered an incompetent officer. It is true that Cardona had deployed his units with too little defensive depth, which certainly contributed to the defeat at Karfreit. But even more serious was the failure of other officers, in particular General Pietro Badoglio, then Corps commander at Tolmin. Cardona himself had been on vacation for most of October, and his deputy had been seriously ill. No, the heavy Italian defeat was due to omissions and mistakes at all levels of command. In addition, the soldiers were suffering from severe war fatigue. As for the Italian High Command, they had not taken seriously the exact time of the attack, which had been communicated to them by a defected Czech and a Romanian officer, since they could hardly imagine that such a major offensive could still take place so late in the year. In fact, Italian investigations after the First World War found that the Italian military intelligence had reported numerous messages about border closures, large-scale troop movements, arrivals of artillery, and so on, up the chain of command, but only a small part of these had actually been taken into account. 4 days after the start of the attack, on October 28th, the Italian headquarters in Udine was captured. Once again, tens of thousands of prisoners were taken, although in this case, they don't seem particularly unhappy. The captured equipment, including artillery and weapons, was immense. Here is a 30.5 centimeter mortar. On the 9th day of the offensive, the Tagliamento River, across which the shattered Italian divisions had fled, was reached along a wide front and crossed at several points. A week later, on November 9th, First Lieutenant Rommel, with his company and a Slovenian Imperial and Royal Company, crossed the Piave River and established a bridgehead on the western bank. Further crossings had taken place on the 11th. But that was the end of this successful German-Austro-Hungarian operation, even though its success was obvious. But the price for it had been high. The attackers suffered 15,000 wounded and 5,000 dead, of whom 945 Germans are buried in the German military cemetery in Tolmin, Slovenia. 2,750 soldiers from the Imperial and Royal Divisions are buried in the Modrice military cemetery. Another 14,515 Austro-Hungarian fallen in the Bondo district of the city of Cella Giudicarie in the Italian region of Trentino, South Tyrol. The Italian army had 29,000 wounded and 11,000 dead, of whom 7,000 are buried in the Italian military cemetery in Karfreit. Another 100,000 Italian soldiers who died in battle are buried at the monumental Reta Puglia War Memorial, built by the fascist regime in 1938. In addition to the many dead and wounded, 300,000 Italian soldiers were also taken prisoner. Now, given the heavy losses suffered by the enemy, it would have made sense to use this victory to completely defeat Italy and thus eliminate the southern front as well. But in the meantime, to stabilize the Italian front, 5 British and 6 French divisions had arrived from the Western Front, and the German High Command, which could not deploy its divisions as freely as the Allies, also had to consider the Italian operation in connection with the events on the other theaters of war. By then, every German division had been in action for years and had been severely depleted, becoming indispensable on the Western Front, where the Entente's material superiority had become increasingly apparent in the decisive sectors. And on the Eastern Front in Russia, every effort was also to be made to bring about a quick end there, which was achieved on December 15, 1917, with the armistice at Brest-Litovsk. With the forces thus freed up, the German High Command then tried in March 1918, albeit unsuccessfully, to bring about a turnaround with one last major offensive, Operation Michael, or the Great Battle in France, before the bulk of the American divisions would arrive in France. Finally, the Italian army, now under the command of General Armando Diaz, was able to stabilize itself again in its defensive positions behind the Piave River, thanks to massive Allied support. The German-Austrian victory in northern Italy in the 12th Battle of the Isonzo was indeed the last major offensive by the Central Powers in the First World War that could be considered a resounding success, as it eliminated the dangerous mountain front on the Isonzo. But all in all, it was merely an episode with no decisive impact on the war. For this, Italy, with the help of the United States, became one of the victors over Austria-Hungary in November 1918, with whom it had been allied until 1915.